Hi, this is Jim Peters. This is Lowell Remembers. We haven't done a Lowell Remembers in a while because Brian Dorrington has left and gone on to a brighter future or something. I don't know. But Brian isn't here anymore, and we're going to have Sean Thibodeau from the Lowell Public Library here in the future, but today you're just stuck with me. A very good documentary on the Potato Famine is on WGBH's Victoria, the story of Queen Victoria, who was the British Queen. In fact, this is an excellent way to determine what the rule of the last strong royal was like. It's by watching this show. I have to recommend it to anybody who wants to know something about England, that they should watch Victoria on WGBH. Anyway, they tell at the end of the Potato Famine show that over 2 million Irishmen and women and children sailed to the United States during the time of the famine. That's 2 million people sailing to the United States. Can you imagine what would happen if we had 2 million people coming to the United States today? They also talk about how the Irish famine robbed the men and families of a staple in the Irish diet, and how the English at first refused to help out the dying Irish. The potato, of course, was the staple in the Irish diet. It was virtually the only thing the Irish ate for sustenance. Queen Victoria saw to it that nothing too big happened to her people, and she counted the Irish as part of her people. Too little, too late, as they say, but eventually the English, who were having a wonderful harvest, gave some food to the Irish at the Queen's behest. 1 million men and women and children died of malnourishment while England dawdled over the Queen's directive. Sir Robert Peel, the Prime Minister of England at the time, argued on the Queen's behalf with those who saw what was happening to the Irish as a sign of a malevolent God. They thought that the reason the Irish were dying out was because God was punishing them. As I stated, 2 million people left Ireland to come live in the United States in probably the greatest immigration wave of all time. The Irish brought over many customs, one of the first of which was to take over the government of each city, state, and even national government available for the taking. And the Irish learned how to use democracy in a very effective way. And it was written up by one of their state senators how it actually happened. And the man said that what they did was count the number of people who were actually on in the town and could actually vote because they were citizens. The Irish redefined patronage and took over the government of many of the towns and cities. My great-great-grandfather moved to South Dakota to become a farmer under the Homestead Act, so he wasn't a Lowell Irishman. He had spent with his wife and children 19 years as an indentured servant in Canada and was more than pleased to make it to the United States, where he took over the land of people who could not stand being on a lonely farm of 40 acres. By the time he died, he reportedly had 1,100 acres under cultivation, which is quite a feat. My father remembered his grandfather well and recalled that the old man chose to paint the top of his barn himself at his age because none of his children would go and do it at their ages. Now his age was, he was in his 80s and they were in their 60s, and they weren't going to climb to the top of the barn to paint it. He was a self-made, stubborn man who left $11,000 to each of his children. In 1980s dollars, when I did the figures, that works out to about $6 million per child. The 1980s were the last time I remember totaling out the amount. In Lowell, the Irish were also driven. They owned many businesses, ran the government in the early part of the 20th century, and basically scared the English. Many Englishmen moved to outlying territories to get away from the Irish. The Irish were nothing if not worthy. So let's start with the Irish, who began immigration here in the 1700s. Of course, Lowell did not exist at that time. This was Chelmsford in Tewksbury and Dracut, but it was not Lowell. But Lowell saw its future and included the Irish in that future. Most early Irish lived on an acre of land near the canals, which became known as the Acre. They had a deep belief in God, the Roman Catholic God. In the book St. Patrick and the Irish by Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston, he stated about St. Patrick that, quote, he was already a great saint with every human passion quelled by a life of constant prayer, fasting, and penance, a saint with a faith that was almost vision, and with a burning love of God and an overwhelming longing to bring souls of the Irish to the feet of the Bible. They had a deep belief in God, the Roman Catholic God. In the book St. Patrick and the Irish by Richard Cardinal Cushing of Boston, he stated that St. Patrick was, quote, already a great saint with every human passion quelled by a life of constant prayer, fasting, and penance, a saint with a faith that was almost vision, with a burning love of God and an overwhelming longing to bring the souls of the Irish to the feet of Christ. And that was written in 1963. With that moniker, who is going to argue? St. Patrick was the inspiration for the new wooden church first built in what is now called the Acre. And many of us go to that church on occasions, especially on during the St. Patrick's Day events. The church is in fine shape, and it is a beautiful church made of fieldstone, granite. The first priest was Father O'Brien. He had a brother who was also a priest and a great help to his brother. The two Father O'Briens set up the church, oversaw the curriculum, and hired the teachers. Now, at the time, they wouldn't use the curriculum that the English provided because they thought that was keeping them away from their God. So they demanded that the curriculum have religion in it. And that was a problem with the Lowell School Committee of the time. The town of Lowell, according to the minutes of the Lowell School Committee, which has records going back to 1826, showed that the people who ran the public schools desired to have a school in what they called District Number 7. District 7 was just a fancy term for the Irish acre. That was the acre. They even hired the only public school teacher whose first name was Desiree and whose last name was a French name. She was a French Catholic. There was one problem. The Irish had no intention of relinquishing the rights to educate their children or to see to the education of their children. They built small schools and charged the costs to Irish parents. The system worked. An Irish mother would collect all the pay that the family made over the course of the week and make sure that the rent was paid, make sure that the food was purchased, and make sure that the father had some thing in the way of something to drink. The system worked. Many students were educated, and the public schools oversaw the testing of Irish Catholic students. They tested on par with the students in the public schools, even if they did not have factory-built desks or materials beyond their small blackboards and chalk. There were probably 5 Catholic schools at one point. We're not sure because the Catholics did not keep as good records as the Protestants did. The Protestants knew exactly how many schools they had at any given time. but the Catholic schools were more hidden from the public. Suffice it to say that Catholic schools could maintain the same level of excellence in these early days as the public schools, maybe even better since the curriculum was so direct. Early on, the Pilgrims had one book for the children. It was called the Bible. That was the first curriculum used in America. It was used in Plymouth and Jamestown, Virginia. It was largely used in Plymouth because the Plymouth Pilgrims incorporated the Bible as their reading book in their teaching of their children. Prayer was the guiding light of the day. St. Patrick, writing on prayer, said, quote, "The love of God came to me more and more, and my faith was strengthened. My spirit was so moved that in a single day I would say as many as 100 prayers, and I would say almost as many in the night." So he said 100 prayers at night and 100 prayers in the daytime. Before St. Patrick appeared quote, "Before St. Patrick appeared in history as a teacher who could reach the pagan mind and convert it to the truth of Christ, he spent 6 years on a mountaintop commiserating with the heavens. He learned patience. The Protestants of early Lowell never had to learn that. They appointed the one teacher to District 7. She was later dropped and then picked up again. She faced an empty schoolhouse because the Irish refused to send the children to public schools. This was a time when most of the Lowell schools were single teacher buildings, country day schools type of thing. It was the duty of the teacher to arrive early, prepare for the day's curriculum, and stoke the stove so that the children could be warm. At the end of the day, she, and it was almost always a she, had to put the fire out. There was a man who was responsible for maintaining the wood necessary to fuel the stoves, but the fire itself was required that the teachers build. Wood-burning stoves were relatively new devices in this day, and there must have been some learning curves in the process. Prior to this, they had just fireplaces, and they lost most of their heat up the fireplace. The heat from the wood stoves was in the center, in the front part of the building, and the wood stoves were probably on a learning curve. Anyway, St. Patrick's Church grew in population and size. It was a splendid wooden building, and as such suffered a fiery death early in the 19th century. There was no way to put out the fire, basically. They hadn't invented the fire engine yet, and the only way to put out the fire was to throw buckets of water on it, and that, even though they had the canal there, they didn't have a way of getting the water to the fire, so the church was ruined. It was replaced by the more permanent granite building that we see now at St. Patrick's. It was the scene of weddings, funerals, masses, and organizational meetings. It was the foundation of the Irish Catholic congregation of the day. Cardinal O'Connell came from Lowell, from that congregation. Cardinal O'Connell was the inspiration for the movie of the 1950s, which was called The Cardinal. He was a Lowellian, and it was a good book to read. It was also a good movie to go to. Not that all schools opened by the school committee did not have some success. Mrs. Legate, her first name was Laura, was quite successful with the few who came to her District 7 school. She was the second teacher in the Irish system, in the public school system for the Irish. The school department reported that Miss Legate's School of Irish Children, quote, presented an example of order, maintained almost exclusively by moral means of animated and thorough teaching, in which oral instruction has had a long place. This was from the Irish Genesis of Lowell. The bishop in charge of the Irish schools said that in the year 1851, the state authorities felt and openly showed anxiety and even intense alarm at the invasion of the foreigners. This was at the time that the 2 million people were coming from Ireland. We had over, as I said, 2 million new Americans fleeing Ireland and coming to the United States. President John Kennedy said it was the greatest test of our mettle that we accepted them. They in turn built railroads, farms, textile machinery, other machinery, and children. They had plenty of children who needed to be educated. I wish I had time to cover the Advent and times of St. Patrick's Church. It was a blessed time in our local Irish history, and I will have to do that story before St. Patrick's Day, when Sean Thibodeau starts up. We unfortunately are out of time. Suffice it to say that our ancestors were teachers, policemen, and firemen. They lived steady lives and workers, laborers. In fact, it was the Irish who largely built the canals because they were the only ones who would use the gunpowder. They lived steady lives and passed on the respect for the law to those many whose descendants are now practicing the law. But there will be more on that later. The Irish in the United States came all over the United States, settled all over the United States. 2 million people could not settle in one small spot. So they came all over the United States, and they were part of the buildup of the United States in the 1870s and 1880s. And my grandparents were born in the 1880s, so wasn't that long ago. Anyway, we'll have some time to do the St. Patrick's Day story and some more on St. Patrick's Church. And I'm looking forward to having Sean Thibodeau with me, because I think that Sean and I will have a great time together bringing you Lowell Remembers. I would be amiss if I didn't recognize the tremendous difficulty that Parkland, Florida has been going through over the past week, when 17 of their school children and teachers were murdered by a person who almost made it out of the school and became free. The thing that I think is most impressive about these children is that they came up with what I consider to be the most legitimate argument against the Second Amendment that we have. They said, people said that they have the right to the Second Amendment, and the kids said, we have the right to live. And I think that that is one of the strongest statements I've ever heard kids say about something as difficult as the Second Amendment. And I'm impressed totally with those kids. I don't even know what you would call it. They're chutzpah. They just were dedicated to the idea that they wanted to honor the people who died. And they marched on Washington yesterday and had a meeting with the president, and the meeting with the president went pretty well. The president said he was going to get rid of butt stocks, and so there wouldn't be automatic weapons. And he said he would entertain the idea of people being 21 before they were given a license to own a gun, or at least an assault weapon. The fact is that these kids have fought back, and they brought up something that's extremely important, and that is that we all have the right to live. And they are living in a time when their right to live is appreciated by them more than it possibly ever could have been at any other time, because so many of their friends died. And I think that all of us will pray for them and want to be kind of like them a little bit. And I don't personally believe that the Second Amendment has to be taken at its word, it has to be taken at its verbiage. The Second Amendment is, it would be logical to carry the Second Amendment to the nth degree if you took it literally at its word, at its verbiage. If the NRA started to say that we have the right to weapons, then it would be logical to say that if you know how to build a nuclear weapon, you have the right to have it in your house, in my opinion. And I think that we definitely do not allow bombs or nuclear weapons or anything like that as part of the Second Amendment. But by the way the Second Amendment is used, people are going to die from the use of assault rifles. And I think that we have to not have assault rifles available to children. And I don't even think we need assault rifles, period. When I was a kid, you didn't have assault rifles. You had, if you had a 12-gauge shotgun, you were doing pretty well. But now it's, the assault rifles can rip through your body and tear you apart in milliseconds. And I just don't believe that the children of the United States have to live with the fear of going to school as a fear that has something to do with their right to exist. And I think that that's what the children of that school district are finding out and are talking to people about. And I think it's a good exercise in social studies. I'm a social studies teacher, and I think it's a good exercise in social studies. So I would just like to wish my best to the people of Parkland, Florida. I think that they are behaving in a way that is extremely wonderful, to be honest with you. And I think they ought to have a lot of respect for their children at this difficult time. So, to the children of Parkland, Florida, and to the people of Parkland, Florida, I wish the best. This is Jim Peters on Lowell Remembers, and you may disagree with me, but hopefully disagreement is a part of the place where you start to have arguments over something, not deaths over something. So I just believe that we need to listen to the children of Parkland, Florida. Thank you.